So HBO Max typically not only has the best selection of movies available, but they also have the best selection of lesser known movies. In this video, we're going to be talking about 20 movies you've probably missed that are well worth watching on HBO Max. This video is sponsored by Raycon, but I'll tell you more about them later in the video. Right now, I want to start this list off with my number 20 pick, which is a hidden gem from Ireland starring Michael Fassbender and Brendan Gleeson in Trespass Against Us. This is about a family of outlaws living out in the pastures of Ireland. Think Brad Pitt from the movie Snatch. It's basically the same type of encampment. Michael Fassbender is a father trying to figure out how to pull his family away from this small criminal enterprise run by Brendan Gleeson's character, the patriarch of the family. Ultimately, the story here never quite got going for me, but this movie's got some fantastic moments and some really dynamite performances from Fassbender and Gleeson. My next pick is actually a big budget period piece from China that, believe it or not, has a ton of English spoken in it because it also stars John Cusack in Shanghai. Now, this takes place in Shanghai in 1941, and the movie actually does a really good job of explaining and displaying how Shanghai was run back then. It's divided up into these different areas where English speakers are allowed to go, and this movie overall feels a lot like Chinatown, oddly enough. Now, it is looser, it's not nearly as solid of a movie, but if you tend to like movies like this, sort of the neo-noir 1940s type thing, then Shanghai is a fantastic one. Just again, the storytelling is not glued together as tightly as it should be to make this a killer and enduring movie, but again, if you're a fan of this genre, you like the way that this movie looks, then it's a solid pick on HBO Max right now. It's just probably not really a rewatchable one. One of the wildest, weirdest, and easily most crass characters that Jude Law has ever played is Don Hemingway in Don Hemingway.
Only use a gun to hold up a place, or threaten someone, or rob them, or pistol whip them, or scare them, but no hunting.
In this movie, he plays an English gangster, a safecracker to be more specific. He's released from prison at the beginning of the movie after 12 years of keeping his mouth shut, and he comes back into society trying to reclaim what he thinks he is owed. Really, this movie is about this character and Jude Law's performance. If you like English gangster movies, this is going to be a must-watch for you, but if you're just a fan of his and you want to see him do a wild character, Don Hemingway is also going to be the movie for you, but I will say this is one of these slower picks off of this list. Now, my next pick is an absolutely stunning movie that takes place in Colombia. It's titled Manos, and it actually revolves around a group of child soldiers living out in the jungle. The movie opens up with him actually having a prisoner, and the style of this movie is not only visually stunning with just absolutely top-notch cinematography, but it is an art film. It's fairly slow-paced and does zero hand-holding along the way. Doesn't mean it's a complicated plot and it's hard to follow, but the movie is not going to explain anything to you. It's just going to display what's happening. Now, you do get somewhat of an adventure story here with some light action, but I almost hesitate to tell you that because it really is not an action movie. But that said, it is a wild story about these child soldiers living out in the jungle that are really lost. It's almost got a Lord of the Flies type thing, again, with just some of the absolute best cinematography I've seen in years. My next pick is actually a really funny movie starring Paul Giamatti as a wrestling coach in Win Win.
You're cold.
Yeah, because I'm lying on the ground.
Come on, I'm gonna warm you up. It's okay.
Derry.
It's okay.
Are you all right?
Doctor says it's stress.
Sorry. Did he prescribe anything for you?
Yeah, jogging.
Now, in this movie, he ends up taking a very underprivileged child, a neglected teenage boy, into his home, but prior to that, he's up to some shenanigans that actually put him into this situation, and Paul Giamatti is always great, but this movie is actually much more loaded than it would seem on the surface, yet you still get some really fantastic scenes and some funny moments, not just from Giamatti. Amy Ryan is particularly good in this as the mother, and the family gets put in some interesting situations again with this child who has really not been raised very well up to this point. But it's not just a heartwarming coming of age thing. Like I said, Giamatti is not a fantastic person when the movie starts out, so there's some very interesting elements in this movie as well. If you typically like things like this, Win Win is a top-notch pick. My next pick on this list is far and away the weirdest movie on this list, easily one of the weirdest on HBO Max right now, but it's actually kind of a heartwarming story called BRIGSBY Bear. And no, this is not a children's movie, even though some of the themes do feel kind of like Saturday morning television. And that's because Kyle Mooney, who's most famous from SNL, plays a man who's been trapped in a bunker his entire life. He's suddenly freed and decides to make a movie about the only real character he's ever known or seen, BRIGSBY Bear. Now, sounds kind of dark, kind of like a kid's movie at the same time, and it's exactly that. While I do not recommend this for children, it does kind of have that vibe, but it also has some crass humor and some pretty heavy themes as well. But the really strange and unusually consistent style of BRIGSBY Bear is what kept me entertained all the way through it. If you like stranger, offbeat stuff, then BRIGSBY Bear is an absolute gem. Next up, I've got an Australian crime thriller that actually stars Ewan McGregor and got hardly any attention back when it was released, despite being a solid prison flick, Son of a Gun. In this movie, Ewan McGregor plays a notorious, in fact, the most notorious criminal in Australia at the time. He, some buddies, and a young man who he's taken under his wing escape in order to pull off a gold heist. So you actually get quite a bit of a heist element with this movie, a little bit of action, and it is a prison movie at the same time. It's got a lot going on in it, yet it's all glued together really well, and it works. It's also got this Australian vibe that's kind of unique to Australia. It doesn't really feel like an American crime movie. It's got some really great moments in it and some great cinematography for something in this genre. If you typically like crime movies, this is going to be a fantastic one on HBO Max that I know most of you haven't seen yet. For something a little lighter, I've got a romantic comedy with a heavy dose of action in it in Hit and Run. Now, this not only stars real-life husband and wife Dax Shepard and Kristen Bell, but Shepard actually wrote and directed this movie, and I thought he did a hell of a job. This is a really fun romantic comedy about a road trip in some really fast, souped-up cars. Dax Shepard actually grew up in car culture, and there's quite a bit of that in this movie, making it an amazing date night movie because it is a solid rom-com that's not cheesy or contrived really in any kind of way that's significant, yet it's also a really cool car movie, so there's something for everybody with Hit and Run. I failed to mention that Bradley Cooper has kind of a cameo role in this. If you're a fan of his, don't miss what he did in this movie, trust me. Now, I've got another crime movie on this list that stars heavy hitter Lawrence Fishburne, and it's actually an amazing role from him earlier in his career, Deep Cover. Now, this was actually directed by the legendary Bill Duke, who most of you know from his role in Predator. He would also go on to do Hoodlum starring Lawrence Fishburne, but I'm partial to Deep Cover. In this movie, Lawrence Fishburne plays a cop who is put on a deep undercover operation infiltrating drug dealers, one of them played by Jeff Goldblum. He's actually a Jewish lawyer who's peddling cocaine. Both guys, Fishburne and Goldblum, are amazing in this movie. They are really what make this movie worth watching. I mean, back when it was released, it was probably a cool 1992 crime movie that was likely overshadowed by other great crime movies coming out at the time, but Lawrence Fishburne is barely chewing up the scenery. I mean, he's doing a little bit of overacting in kind of the best way possible. It really is a fantastic character from him. And then Jeff Goldblum is matching him tit for tat, scene for scene, playing this kind of young coke-dealing lawyer. Again, they're both great. If you're a fan of either, make this one of the first ones you watch off of this list, especially if you love 90s crime movies as much as I do. Don't miss this gem. Speaking of the 90s, though, I've got a highly underrated movie that was actually the directorial debut of actor Jonah Hill. Now, this is kind of a boilerplate coming-of-age story, yet it takes place in the mid-90s, and Jonah Hill captured the flavor of the mid-90s perfectly in this movie, making the title absolutely perfect. But you follow a young boy growing up in Los Angeles who falls in with a group of skateboarders. Now, this does have kind of a vintage feel. It's a little slow-paced. It almost feels like a product of the 90s, but it's perfectly executed. Now, if you're not into the fact that Jonah Hill directed it, you're not into the mid-90s vibe, which again is just pitch perfect in this movie, then I'm not sure there's a lot else for you to grab onto outside of the coming-of-age story, which they're kind of a dime a dozen. Mid-90s just happens to be an exceptional one. Now, just this past week, I rewatched all the John Wick movies in order with headphones on. It sounded amazing. I highly recommend it. Today's sponsor, Raycon, offers great headphones just like these everyday earbuds that are perfect for movies, obviously music, podcast, audiobooks, you name it. Raycon offers the same top quality audio that you get from premium brands for half the price, less than half the price in some cases, which means you can get a spare pair or a gift and still pay less than a lot of the top brands out there. And they don't just sound good, they come with premium features as well. One of my favorites is the noise isolation mode, which does a great job of blocking out outside noise. And the awareness mode is fantastic when I'm around the house. I can hear the kids great and they don't have to listen to my music. And just for comparison, I do have a more expensive pair that I used to work out with, and they would fall out from time to time. My Raycons really don't fall out no matter what I'm doing. They're in there and they feel nice, grippy, and comfortable. And in this economy, Raycon wants to make sure that you love your order, so they offer easy, free returns, and they even have buy now, pay later options. But again, to get yours, go to the link in the description or just go to buyraycon.com/flickconnection to get 15% off your Raycon order. But speaking of fantastic stuff, let's move on with the rest of the movie recommendations on this list. Now, I've been so busy watching all the John Wick movies lately that I did not get a chance to go see the new Evil Dead movie in theaters. I've heard it's great, and the director of that movie's previous film is currently included on HBO Max. The Hole in the Ground is an unusually effective horror movie. Now, this is sort of like a body snatcher type story, but done in a way unlike anything I've ever seen. This too is very slow paced, but that slow pace is incredibly effective in The Hole in the Ground. You follow a young mother and child out in the countryside, and she begins to notice weird things about her son. Like the fact that he likes to go on long walks in the woods at night and just doesn't quite seem like himself. I mean, honestly, aside from the title, that's about all you need to know. But again, it's just incredibly effective at creeping the crap out of you. My number 9 pick on this list is another throwback flick from the 90s. This one not only has an all-star cast with just really odd characters like Crispin Glover, Billy Bob Thornton, Iggy Pop, and a lot more, it's also a Western with a lead role from Johnny Depp in Dead Man. Now, this is a cult classic, but I'm certain there's people watching that have never seen this. This is from director Jim Jarmusch, who has a couple of other movies on HBO Max right now. One being Coffee and Cigarettes, which is a really fun anthology, and my number 6 pick on this list, believe it or not. But Dead Man is a black and white Western from 1995, and it's very dialogue heavy. In fact, the story is that Johnny Depp's character is out in the West, he's new to the territory, takes a bullet very early on in the story, and then sort of is slowly dying throughout the story. It ends up being an excuse to get him and some other fantastic actors doing these really bizarre scenes in a Western movie. If you like any of the actors involved, especially if you're a big fan of Johnny Depp, this is a really cool movie to watch, but don't expect this movie to hit you over the head with story. There's not a whole lot to be had here, yet if you like some of the elements I've discussed, then there's just a lot to love with Dead Man. My number 8 selection on this list is a downer of a movie, but it is worth watching because of the dynamite performances in Blue Valentine. Ryan Gosling and Michelle Williams play a young couple, or rather, it chronicles their relationship in this movie. They meet as a young couple, fall in love, get married, have a family, and begin to sort of age out of their relationship. It's the best way I can put it, but as dry and as simple as that sounds, and the fact that it's, something a lot of people deal with in their lives, almost everybody, Blue Valentine brings it to life in a spectacular, yet really grounded way. This too is fairly slow paced, but just has some really fantastic scenes that are not only really well acted, but they're very well produced. Meaning they don't just look good, but the way they actually performed a lot of this is fairly realistic. I mean, when you see them waking up in the morning in this movie, they're not acting. They actually went to sleep in the bed that they're in, and they're literally waking up with cameras rolling. Little touches like that add this level of realism to Blue Valentine that you just don't get from most other movies. Now, my number 7 pick is a real crowd pleaser of a neo-noir film, a crime movie, starring John Hawkes, titled Small Town Crime.
What is that, blood in there? Yeah. It's gonna be extra.
Now, I think most of you will get into this movie within the first 5 minutes. Not only is John Hawkes one of my favorite actors to watch on screen, he's just dynamite in everything he does, but the supporting cast is really fantastic here. You've got one of Robert Forster's last roles. Clifton Collins Jr. is always fun to watch, and then you get Anthony Anderson and Octavia Spencer. They're not in it much, but still, some dynamite cast members. And it's about a murder investigation in a very small town with very little leads to pull on, and is way more engaging than I would have thought. If you like some of the other murder mystery movies I've recommended recently on the channel, movies like Wind River, I highly recommend Small Town Crime. In fact, it's a lot lighter than some of those would be, surprisingly so. Now, Jim Jarmusch makes the list again with what I think is just one of the coolest movies he's ever done, and probably one of the coolest movies Forest Whitaker has ever starred in, Ghost Dog. The full title is Ghost Dog: The Way of the Samurai, because in this movie, Forest Whitaker plays a hitman for the mafia that follows the way and tenets of the samurai. And I will admit, on paper, this does not sound very good. In fact, it sounds like a dumb movie. But in the hands of someone like Jim Jarmusch, he just literally breathes life into a basic, almost hacky concept and makes it this colorful, vibrant, fun experience to watch. In fact, this came out in 1999 and feels a lot like the gangster movies that came out of the early and mid-90s, but it's got this art house Jim Jarmusch flavor that completely sets it apart. There's a killer soundtrack with this movie, some interesting scenes that again just would not have worked if this movie were not done by a director like Jarmusch. Legendary actor Guy Pearce stars in my next pick, and it too is a grungy, I guess we'll call crime movie from Australia, titled The Rover.
Let's go! Come on, come on, come on! Turn the car around!
We're not turning around. He's gone.
What do you mean he's gone? He's my brother!
Now, the reason I hesitate to say crime is because this takes place in a dystopian future, almost a post-apocalyptic type Australia. There's still some military, militia, but it appears as if government has completely collapsed. That alone makes The Rover feel very different from any other post-apocalyptic movie I've ever seen and makes it feel much more real. Guy Pearce plays an absolute badass in this movie right from the jump, and then you get an incredibly interesting role from Robert Pattinson. You gotta keep in mind, this was right on the heels of him doing the Twilight movies, and before he had really made a scene on the indie circuit. This was one of the early roles he was doing during that time. Not only does he kill it, but he really shows that he's capable of a lot more than you've probably seen him do. Don't expect an action movie with this. There is action in it. In fact, the trailer is stacked with some action, but this is a story-driven movie. Some of you are gonna love the way that this movie wraps up, and I mean absolutely love it, and others of you are gonna hate it, but that's just the way it goes. Now, my next pick comes all the way back from 1955. I know I don't recommend a lot of classic movies on this channel, but it's mostly because I'm recommending more lesser-known movies, and honestly, most of the classic movies on streaming services are pretty well known, but one of my favorite movies on HBO Max right now is Mr. Roberts. This stars Henry Fonda and Jack Lemmon as some people on a supply ship in World War II. And what's so fantastic about the themes in Mr. Roberts is you're following Henry Fonda's character, who desperately wants to get into the war, yet he's stuck on a coastline on this supply ship and just doesn't feel like he's contributing. The movie conveys that theme incredibly well, and that's really what I love about it, on top of there being some incredibly fun scenes for a movie about a bunch of guys on a supply ship. I mean, Jack Lemmon alone brings a lot of life to this movie. He is a real fun character to have on that boat, but they make fake whiskey, they do their best to get women on the boat, they prank the captain. It's just kind of wild, fun stuff, especially for 1955. And it's ultimately fairly lighthearted and has some really nice themes for a movie that takes place during World War II. All right, my number 3 pick is another weird one, but it's also incredibly fun. In fact, it's one of the major themes of The Beach Bum.
Wish me luck. I'm off to write the next great American novel. I may have a gangbang when I get back. I will invite your mother.
Thank you, Mr. Moondog.
Now, for as big a star as Matthew McConaughey is, this is easily one of the more lesser-known movies he's been in the last few years. This one and my number 1 pick. But in The Beach Bum, he actually plays this famous poet who is basically drinking himself to death in the Florida Keys. Now, it's not like Leaving Las Vegas. He's not really trying to kill himself, but he is drinking and drugging and f***ing everything in sight, making this an incredibly fun and colorful experience. But there's also quite a bit of meat on the bone with The Beach Bum. Now, there's not much of a plot. In fact, this is a fairly plotless movie. It's more of a character study. But Matthew McConaughey brings this guy to life in an amazing way. I feel like I know the guy. And it's partly because I grew up on a coastal area and I've met guys like this in my life. But Matthew McConaughey also obviously knows guys like this because he embodied it perfectly. Now, this is directed by Harmony Korine, who's famous for some really bombastic movies like Kids and Spring Breakers. Jimmy Buffett shows up for a little bit. If you're into any of that, check out The Beach Bum, but just keep an open mind as this thing kind of approaches the end.
Do it again, do it again.
Now, my next pick is another underrated movie with an all-star cast that actually had a decent-sized budget. This is one of the bigger budget movies on this particular list, but it still never got the love it deserved: The Brothers Bloom. Now, I say all-star cast. You've got Rachel Weisz, Adrien Brody, and Mark Ruffalo in a fantastic and fun caper movie. Brody and Ruffalo play a couple of con men that swindle billionaires out of loads of money with these really complex plots. Their latest target, in fact their last target, is played by Rachel Weisz, and she's this really odd character that obviously is a billionaire but also has all these weird hobbies, and that's just where the quirky nature of this movie takes off, and it just continues. It feels almost like a Wes Anderson movie at times, yet it's got this complicated caper-type plot. In fact, this feels like it's derived from something like a best-selling book or graphic novel series, but no, this is an original work by director Rian Johnson, who also did Looper, but most recently Knives Out and The Glass Onion. In fact, I would put this movie up there with Knives Out. If you were a fan of that one, even if you didn't like The Glass Onion, I still highly recommend checking out The Brothers Bloom. Now, I mentioned Matthew McConaughey starred in my #1 pick. Longtime subscribers might already be suspicious that I'm about to recommend the movie Mud. And I am. It's been a while since I've recommended this movie because I haven't seen it available on streaming services in quite a bit, but you can catch it on HBO Max right now. This is far and away my favorite movie from director Jeff Nichols, but for reference, he also directed Take Shelter with Michael Shannon and Midnight Special, also with Michael Shannon. But in Mud, Matthew McConaughey plays this drifter fugitive who's hiding out in the woods when a couple of young boys come across him, and obviously against their better judgment, they decide to help him. Now, the performances are all good, the cinematography's fine. Those aren't the reasons I love this movie. I love this one because of the story and how authentic the setting feels. I grew up in South Mississippi, and while this is in Arkansas, it feels very much like the places that I grew up in, and the kid's story feels very much like things I got into as a kid. Again, Matthew McConaughey feels like someone I've met in my life. He's one of my favorite actors for that reason, and this is easily one of my favorite movies of his, which is really saying something. I mean, the guy's been in some dynamite stuff. This is the one that has just connected with me the most over the years. If you typically love my recommendations, don't miss Mud before it's gone from HBO Max. But the full list I just discussed can be found in the top pinned comment as always. Also, be sure to check out that Raycon link in the video description. Thanks to them for sponsoring another video, but I will keep making these videos as long as you keep watching them. Thanks for checking out this special HBO Max episode, and you will see me on the next one.